Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to our second event of the year with Andriy. Andriy is a graduate student at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on aesthetics, the philosophy of literature, philosophy of art, and especially where those intersect with the philosophy and language and metaphysics. He's worked on topics including the ontological status of fictional entities, the relationship between works of art and the objects that constitute them, and the difference between artistic and communicative intention. Is there anything that you would like to add to your introduction, Andriy?
Oh, that was just perfect. Thank you so much, Jayla. I really appreciate the APS for inviting me here, and I'm grateful to all of you for attending this talk. The UTSC, which is what the APS is affiliated with, has an awesome undergraduate philosophical community. I mean, I've TA'd several courses here, and it was a fantastic experience. I sort of wish I could be here in person because I love the campus too. But well, I'm sure we'll have a great conversation over Zoom as well. Now, before I begin the talk, let me just do, since this is a public conversation, a public talk, let me just do a very brief land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. And let's just take a very brief moment to sort of think about what that acknowledgement means and what it commits us to. So, folks, my talk will cover some of the issues in philosophy of art and philosophy of language that my dissertation is dealing with. If you're interested in how all of this is possible, my dissertation's committee is made of Sonia Sedevi, Amy Mullen, and Diana Rothman. You might know some of these people. Their support and advice has been extremely helpful. My research is supported by the OGS, by the School of Graduate Studies and the Philosophy Department, so I'm grateful to them for making it possible. But I also have sort of a lot of appreciation for the broader philosophical community, both graduate and undergraduate. Conversations with my peers and with my students have been just incredibly helpful throughout the research and the writing process. Okay, so let me get the, let me share my screen with you, or rather share the PowerPoint that I'm planning to use. The title of my talk, as you can see, is Conversations with Friends, Art, Interpretation, and Conversational Ethics. Now, let's get some preliminaries out of the way first. In this talk, I'm using the term art broadly in a way that applies to works of literature, to cinema, to visual art, and so on. Now, philosophers of art commonly agree that one of the characteristic properties of works of art is that they warrant interpretation. But there's a lot of disagreement about the proper object of interpretation, by which I mean the properties that audience members ought to seek to identify when interpreting works of art. Now, these properties are often called, kind of more or less neutrally, work meaning properties. And work meaning properties come in several varieties. In literature, which is kind of my main source of examples in this talk, work meaning properties range from fairly local ones, so references of proper names, the contents of individual sentences, to fairly global ones, like the properties of tone, of theme, and of thesis. Now, philosophical disagreements over these properties concern their nature, right? What sort of things are they? and their relationship with communicative conventions, the intention of the artist, and the audience's input. Now, first of all, what sort of meaning do these properties possess? I mean, they are work meaning properties, but what sort of meaning is it? Is it the so-called natural meaning of the sort that speakers predicate in statements like, these clouds mean rain? Or is it communicative meaning of the sort that speakers predicate or attribute in claims like, when I said I like your work, I really meant what I said? Now, it seems likely that the meaning in question is communicative. But if that's the case, then what exactly is it fixed by? Is it fixed by communicative conventions? Is it fixed by the communicative intention of the actual author? Is it perhaps fixed by the communicative intention of a hypothetical ideal author? Or is it fixed by the reader's interest-guided input, the readers or the viewers? Now, in this talk, I will argue that there's an important class of work meaning properties that are fixed in neither of the ways covered in the sort of existing literature or existing research on the subject. Now, this class includes themes and other aboutness properties of works of art. I'm going to argue that these properties are communicative, that they are a species of conversational topics or conversational aboutness properties, and that they're fixed by the institutionally grounded agreement between artists and their audience. And then I'm going to consider a couple of objections to this view, and in particular, objections that appeal to conversational ethics or to conversational norms. Now, let's think about aboutness. Let's consider a couple of statements that that attribute certain properties to a work of art, for example, to James Baldwin's novel called Giovanni's Room. I just finished reading it a few weeks ago, and I'm like under such an impression. Anyway, we can talk about it in the Q&A. Okay, so let's consider two statements. The novel is about a young American man living in Paris who falls in love with a bartender named Giovanni. Second statement, this novel is about social alienation, bisexuality, and nostalgia. Okay, so statements of the former sort are rarely controversial, right? I mean, most readers of Giovanni's Room would kind of converge on something like one. In contrast, statements of the latter sort often generate major disagreements. Is Giovanni's Room really about bisexuality? I mean, interestingly enough, its author claimed that it's not. He claimed that it's about what happens when you're so afraid that you finally cannot love anybody, right? So on Baldwin's view, it's about love, but not say about bisexuality. Moreover, is the novel about race? Baldwin was a Black American writer and activist. He was very keenly interested in the relationship between race and sexuality. And critics have argued that the novel is in some sense, I mean, in whatever sense it is, but in some sense about race as well. Even though, again, the author just denied that it is. Now, contemporary philosophers of literature have been interested in statements of this sort and the aboutness properties predicated or attributed by means of these statements for quite a while. In particular, the sort of property predicated in statements like to, which is, I mean, it's often called thematic or artistic aboutness. This property has just proven to be really, really elusive. Okay, it's a work meaning property, fair enough. It's one of the proper objects of interpretation. But what sort of meaning does it possess? Natural or communicative? Some philosophers have argued that artistic aboutness is closer to natural than to communicative aboutness. So, for example, John Gibson, a contemporary philosopher of art, argued that to say something like Giovanni's room is about social alienation is similar to saying the latest election bill is about voter suppression. Right? So in both cases, according to Gibson, we use these about F expressions to predicate a non-communicative property, a property that has to do with significance rather than signification. Now, other philosophers have argued that artistic aboutness is a communicative property, although interestingly enough, no one seems clear on what sort of property it is. And there's a lot of disagreement over what this property is fixed by. Now, according to intentionalists like Noel Carroll, it's fixed by the communicative intention of the artist. A work of art is about F if and only if the artist intended it to be about F and used the right communicative devices to convey her intention. According to imputationalists like Peter Lamarck, a work of art is about F if and only if viewers or readers, or generally speaking, audience members construe it as being about F by assigning salience to some of its parts, by taking some of its parts as kind of prominent. There are issues with all of these accounts, but I wouldn't go over them right now. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you folks are interested. What I'm asking you at this point is to take for granted that we need a better account of themes and other species of artistic aboutness. Now, a good starting place would involve settling on the desiderata, which is the fancy word for things that we want our account to accomplish. So what should an account of artistic aboutness do? Now, in my view, it should explain three characteristic features of this property: its relevance to interpretation, its structural role, and its connection to value. And I think, upon reflection, I think these features are pretty uncontroversial. It's clear that artistic aboutness is interpretationally relevant. If we believe that a work of art is about so-and-so, this belief will guide, in some sense, our interpretation of its local features. The structural role of artistic aboutness might be a little less evident, but it's been discussed by several philosophers of art, including Carroll, including Beardsley. They observed that themes and other aboutness properties kind of allow diverse parts of a work of art to be linked to one another and explain how salient or prominent parts of a work of art form a coherent whole, right? Like in some sense, aboutness holds works of art together. The links between aboutness and value, I think, are pretty uncontroversial. I mean, they're reflected in ordinary talk, they're reflected in criticism, in philosophy of art. On the one hand, the how matters, right? We enjoy observing how a work of art presents and develops its theme, and we really we praise those that do it well. And on the other hand, the what matters too, right? We praise works of art for speaking about things that matter to us personally, for speaking about things of greater human interest or of interest to our communities, and for saying something about art. Now, in this talk, I'm going to assume that aboutness properties of works of art are communicative, that the meaning they possess is communicative meaning. And if that's the case, then I think a natural place to look for a clear account of these properties, of aboutness properties, would be contemporary philosophy of language. And luckily, they've been discussing communicative aboutness for quite a while, at least since 1930s. There are two aboutness properties that have been identified in these discussions. Now, one of them is sentential aboutness. the property of sentences of the form A is F. Right? So my coffee is warm. Today's Friday. It's Friday. Okay. Anyway, so sentences like these are clearly about something, right? They're, they are about A, they are about F, they are about the F-ness of A, and so on and so forth. We might disagree over that. Philosophers of language interested in sentential aboutness have been working on these sort of highly technical set theoretic models of this property and on way it affects the content of individual sentences. Another aboutness property is conversational aboutness, the property of conversations and of utterances made in conversations. Sometimes these utterances are called a little more technically conversational moves. So conversations and conversational moves are clearly about something, right? I mean, we are having a conversation about art right now. And the aboutness of conversations and conversational moves is not easily reducible to the aboutness of sentences that occur in these conversations and moves. And philosophers of language interested in this kind of aboutness have been working on ways of figuring out how it affects various features of conversational moves. Now, for all sorts of reasons that, again, I'm not going to elaborate on at this point, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. For all sorts of reasons, I think that sentential aboutness is kind of a non-starter if we're interested in artistic aboutness. But conversational aboutness seems like a very good candidate for an account of artistic aboutness that satisfies our desiderata, that does what we want it to do. Okay, now let's look at conversational aboutness a bit more closely. So consider a conversation C1 in which interlocutors S1 and S2 perform conversational moves M1 and M2. So think about the conversation that you hopefully are seeing on your screens between two speakers, Max and Sam. How was your day? Or how was your day? I did some reading, then wrote a few paragraphs of my paper, then spent the rest of the day watching Netflix. Okay, that's a pretty standard conversation. Now, it is about something, right? It's about the speaker's day. Let's say Sam, it's about Sam's day. And the conversational moves performed by the interlocutors are about Sam's day because that's what the conversation is about. Now, let's get a little more technical. Let's call that which a conversation is about, or the conversation's topic, T. We can say that T is the topic of a conversation C, and that M1 and M2 are about T because, in some sense of because, C, the conversation, is about T. Now, what sort of thing is T exactly? What sort of thing is a conversational topic? The nature of conversational topics, again, is subject to quite a few debates in philosophy of language. But there's an intuition that I think is shared by many philosophers that conversational topics can be modeled on questions. Now, this intuition suggests that a conversation is about T if and only if it revolves or is organized in some sense around a T-related question, right? A conversation is about Sam's day if in some sense it revolves or it's organized around some question that deals with Sam's day, like the question featured in M1. Now, philosophers of language disagree on how to describe this question precisely, but this disagreement is not super important for our purposes. The central claim that I want to make at this point is that artistic aboutness is a species of conversational aboutness, and that for a work of art to be about T is for it to be a conversational move made in a conversation about T, or a little more technical, in a conversation whose topic is T. Now, let's see if my account of artistic aboutness meets the desiderata that I outlined earlier. I mean, it should explain, the interpretational relevance of artistic aboutness, its structural role, and its connection to value. These are the three things we want our account to deliver. Now, are conversational topics relevant to the interpretation of conversational moves? I mean, clearly they are, right? The topic of a conversation is a part of what philosophers of language call the conversation's context, or the set of the conversation's parameters. So roughly, that's going to be the body of information that is presumed to be available to the participants in the conversation, to the interlocutors, that interlocutors rely on in interpreting each other's conversational moves. So if you're wondering how exactly that's supposed to work, consider the example I've got on the slide. So consider this conversational move M3. Max has been sad since he broke up with Sam. Lately, though, Max has been hanging out with Jesse, and his mood has improved. Now, the interlocutors of S2, the person who said this, who made this conversational move, will interpret it differently depending on what they believe the topic of the conversation is, right? If they believe the conversation is about Max's romantic life, they might take M3 as a hint that, well, Max is now seeing Jesse. If they believe the conversation is about something else, about, for example, Max's mental health, then they will not. Right, so conversational topics are clearly relevant to the interpretation of the meaning properties of conversational moves, just as artistic aboutness is relevant to the interpretation of the work meaning properties of works of art. And treating artistic aboutness like that, I think, allows us to explain the similarities of treating artistic aboutness as conversational aboutness allows us to explain the similarity. In art interpretation, we follow the rules of conversational interpretation. And these rules require us to identify what the conversation is about in order to identify the meaning, or in this case, the work meaning properties of individual moves. Now, what about the structural role of artistic aboutness? Well, conversational topics have a role to play in structuring conversational moves. Now, consider what moves count as coherent. And just a little aside, I mean, coherence is one of these sort of polysemic words philosophers and ordinary speakers use it to talk about all sorts of properties. In the strongest sense, coherence is a property of sets of sentences or sets of beliefs, right? The set is coherent if there are inferential relations between its constituents. In the weakest sense, coherence is a property of sentences. A sentence is coherent if it's grammatically correct, features meaningful words. In the sense that I have in mind here, though, coherence is a property of conversational moves. And in this sense, a move is coherent if it doesn't involve digressions. That is, if it stays on topic. And of course, whether some conversational move counts as coherent depends on the topic of the conversation. Now, again, think about our earlier example. Think about this conversation between S1 and S2. Right? And think about the move that S2 is making. I did some reading, then wrote a few paragraphs of my paper, then spent the rest of the day watching Netflix. Kind of a very relatable conversational move in many circumstances. In our initial scenario, right, this move was made in a conversation about the speaker's day. And for a conversation like that, it counts as pretty coherent. It involves no digressions. I mean, the speaker stays on topic throughout the move. But consider what would happen if an utterance featuring the same words and sentences were made in a conversation about something else, the C1 star that you have on your screens. So a conversation about, for example, how much progress the speaker has made on their paper, right? Are you close to finishing your paper? I did some reading, wrote a few paragraphs, then spent the rest of the day watching Netflix. Okay, in that case, I mean, clearly the move would count as less coherent than in the previous scenario. The last part would be a digression. It would involve the speaker sort of veering off topic. So conversational aboutness does have a role to play in structuring moves in a conversation, just as artistic aboutness has a role to play in structuring works of art. I mean, think about the observations, right, that philosophers of art made on artistic aboutness properties or themes, sort of holding the works of art together, allowing their parts to be linked to one another, explaining how parts form a coherent whole, right? The account of aboutness that I'm presenting here, the account of artistic aboutness, I think helps us explain the link between aboutness and the structure of works of art, right? Aboutness structures works of art in the way conversational topics structure conversational moves, that is, by contributing to their coherence. Now let's consider the last desideratum, the link between artistic aboutness and value. I've said before that there are sort of two sorts of ways artistic aboutness affects the value of artworks. On the one hand, we've got the how. We praise works of art that present and develop their themes well. On the other hand, we've got the what. We praise works that are about things that matter to us as individuals, things that matter to the broader community, and things that matter to the art world. Is conversational aboutness linked to value in similar ways? I mean, kind of intuitively looks like it is, right? I mean, consider the how, the first link. As we mentioned before, aboutness structures conversational moves. Whether a move is coherent depends on whether it stays on the topic of the conversation. And coherence isn't a valuative property. We praise coherent conversational moves. We tolerate those, and we only kind of barely tolerate those that go on and off topic. And we criticize conversational moves that involve a lot of rambling. In conversations, the link between aboutness and value is pretty straightforward, right? The more coherent a move is, the more praiseworthy it is. In works of art, the link is a little less straightforward, right? Sometimes we appreciate what would count as a digression in an ordinary conversation, right? We appreciate that in art, but we wouldn't tolerate it in an ordinary conversational move. Now, in my view, that has something to do with the dependence of coherence in works of art on genre and style, right? Some genres tolerate and some styles tolerate digressions, others do not. But on a high level of generality, the links between aboutness and value in works of art work pretty much in the same way as the links between conversational aboutness and the value of conversational moves, right? Being on topic is linked to coherence. Being coherent is linked to value. Okay. Well, what about the second link between aboutness and value, the what? Now, that one seems pretty easy to meet, right? That desideratum seems pretty easy to meet. Ordinarily, we value conversations about important things, right? I mean, one of the reasons some of us are studying philosophy, majoring in philosophy, or just taking it for credit is or might be because, well, it involves conversations, oral or in writing, on topics that are important to us personally, right? Or are important to the communities that we identify with, including the kind of the broader human community in general. And likewise, it seems to me with works of art, we praise those, I mean, we praise works of art for speaking about stuff that matters to us, right? We praise works of art for speaking about things of general human interest and for making statements about art. And if we treat artistic aboutness as a species of conversational aboutness, we can explain this similarity. We can view works of art as conversational moves made in several conversations at once, right? In a conversation about what matters to the individual audience member, in a conversation about what matters to the broader community, and in a conversation about what matters to the art world. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Now, I've argued that artistic aboutness is a species of conversational aboutness, and that for a work of art to be about tea is for it to be a conversational move made in a conversation about tea. And hopefully I've persuaded you folks that this account of artistic aboutness meets the three conditions that we outlined at the beginning of this discussion. Now, let's consider how exactly artistic aboutness is fixed. What makes it the case that some work of art is about F rather than G? I mean, what makes it the case that, that Baldwin's novel is about social alienation or bisexuality or nostalgia and not about, I don't know, the nightlife of Paris? There's a lot of that going on there too. As I mentioned, there's a lot of disagreement on what fixes artistic aboutness. Intentionalists like Carroll think it's the artist's communicative intention. Imputationalists like Peter Lamarck think it's the audience's input. Now, in my view, if artistic aboutness is a species of conversational aboutness, then we can assume that it's fixed in the way conversational aboutness is fixed. So what makes it the case that some conversation is about F rather than G? On the view that I'm defending here, it's fixed by the mutually recognized agreement between the participants. So slightly more technically, a conversation C between interlocutors S1 and S2 is about T, if and only if S1 agrees to it being about T, believes that this agreement is evident to S2, and believes that S2 agrees to it as well, and likewise for S2. Now, in informal conversations, this kind of agreement is very often, not always, but pretty often established explicitly, and it's pretty easy to revoke or renegotiate it. Informal conversations, though, or conversations conducted in institutional settings, this agreement is often not established explicitly. It's entered tacitly, and it's way harder to revoke or renegotiate. But despite these differences, in both cases, a conversation C, on my view, is about T if and only if the interlocutors are in an explicit or tacit mutually recognized agreement that it is about T. Now, this probably sounds pretty general and pretty technical. So let's look at some examples. How exactly are these agreements fixed? How do they come about, and how are they renegotiated or revoked? Now, for starters, let's just think about a few informal conversations between two interlocutors, I don't know, Sam and Max. Hopefully you can read what's on the screen. I realize that the font is super small, but I'm going to read it out for you anyway. So we've got three conversations, right? The first one goes like this. How's your paper coming? Not so well. I wrote a few sentences, but that's about it. I mean, I gotta say, we've all been there, right? That's the kind of conversation, most of us, including myself, had at some point or other. Okay, second conversation. How's your paper coming? I don't want to talk about it. Let's talk about something else. Sure. Have you seen any good movies recently? And then the third one. How's your paper coming? Not so well. I wrote a few sentences, but that's about it. Actually, I don't want to talk about it. Can we talk about something else? Sure. Seen any good movies recently? Now, in all three cases, the first move, is an invitation to fix the topic of the conversation. In C3, the one I read first, this invitation is accepted, right? And the agreement is established. The conversation is about the speaker's paper. In C4, invitation is rejected, the agreement is not established, and the conversation's topic remains unfixed. In C5, the invitation is first accepted and then rejected. The agreement is first established and then revoked and renegotiated. So in the course of this conversation, its topic moves from the paper to the movies. Now, this sort of explicitness and this sort of flexibility is very characteristic of informal conversations. In these sorts of interactions, the agreement on the topic is very often established explicitly, and it's pretty easy to revoke or renegotiate it. But that's not quite the case with formal conversations, especially those that are conducted or held in institutional settings. So in these conversations, agreements on topics are often established implicitly or are established by default, and it's very hard to revoke or renegotiate them. So think about a scenario in which a student of philosophy is expected to deliver a talk at the APS. So the student, let's call them Sam. So Sam's talk is a move made in a conversation with the attendees, pretty much the way my talk is a conversational move made in a conversation with you folks. And the topic of Sam's conversation is fixed by the agreement between Sam and the APS, right? So the society invited them to talk about philosophy. They accepted their invitation and entered the agreement with the interlocutors that fixed the topic of the conversation. The agreement need not have been made explicitly, right? If a philosophical society invites you to give a talk, then by default, the talk will be about philosophy, and that's what you will agree to. And in formal conversations like these, the agreement on a topic is pretty hard to revoke or renegotiate. If Sam comes into the virtual room and offers to talk about Netflix, I mean, chances are they're going to get a refusal. Now, on the view that I'm proposing here, works of art are conversational moves made in settings closer to the one we just discussed in formal or semi-formal institutional settings. Now, the institutional component of my proposal shouldn't be super contentious. Philosophers of art have talked about the connection between works of art and the art world. The art world on these views is a collection of institutions concerned with production of art, with appreciation of art, evaluation of art, study of it, and so on and so forth. The details are a matter of debate, as always in philosophy, and nothing in my account, I think, hinges on how this debate is resolved. What's crucial from my view is that works of art are produced in an institutional setting. And as with conversational moves made in institutional settings, the properties of works of art are affected by the norms of the relevant institutions, especially, and not just any properties, but the meaning properties. That's what's at stake here. Right. So first, what these institutions, what these institutional norms do is they fix the conversations in which works of art serve as conversational moves. So they fix it, they fix these conversations in a way where a work of art counts as a conversational move in the conversation between the artist and the individual audience members, the one between the artist and the broader community, and the one between the artist and the art world. And second, these institutional norms fix what these conversations are about by default, right? They are about things that are important to the participants. And so by producing a work of art in an institutional setting, on my view, an artist tacitly or implicitly accepts the invitation to participate in these conversations and tacitly agrees to make a conversational move on the default topics of these conversations. Now let's take another pause and do another very quick recap. I've argued that artistic aboutness is a species of conversational aboutness, and that for a work of art to be about T is for it to be a conversational move made in a conversation about T. I've also argued that we can resolve the debate over what fixes artistic aboutness by looking at what fixes conversational aboutness. And I argued that in conversations, aboutness is fixed by the mutually recognized agreement between the interlocutors. In informal conversations, the agreement is explicit and revocable. In formal ones, it's usually tacit, taken by default, and is not that easy to revoke or renegotiate. And I argued that works of art are conversational moves made in formal institutional settings, and that by making a work of art, an artist accepts an invitation to participate in several conversations guided by the norms of the art world, and agrees to make conversational moves on the topics fixed by these norms. Now, let's consider super briefly the upshot of my account of artistic aboutness for art interpretation. So some of the consequences are pretty uncontentious. For example, or even, uncontentious or probably even desirable. So one thing that my account does is that it suggests a way to resolve some interpretative disagreements over artistic aboutness. So think about, for example, think about disagreements that often arise over the aboutness properties of the so-called metafiction or meta art. Some works of contemporary literature or cinema or visual art clearly fall into that category, but that's the case with some of the classics too. Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern, Don Quixote by Cervantes. Are these about art, or are these about things other than art? And on the account that I'm proposing here, disagreements like these can be resolved by relativizing the aboutness property over which we disagree. Relative to the conversation about what's important to the art world, these are about art. Relative to the conversation about what's important to the broader community or to individual readers or audience members, these are about things other than art. Also, think about disagreements over aboutness that sometimes arise between ordinary audience members and professional critics and scholars. So I'm thinking about Sally Rooney's novels, Conversations with Friends or Normal People. I don't know if you've read them, highly recommend it. If you've read her last novel, I envy you because I have not. But in any case, so ordinary speakers or ordinary readers, especially readers of the same age as the characters in the novels, born in the 80s or in the 90s, very often describe it as a kind of a quintessential millennial novel, right? As being about the millennial predicament. Whatever it is, it's not even clear to me whether millennial predicament is a thing. It's not very clear to me whether it's an important thing. And interestingly enough, critics and scholars, and I think Sally Rooney herself denied that it's about the millennial predicament and argued that the novel is really about miscommunication in romantic relationships or about the way people construe one another. What's interesting about disagreements like these is that they're very entrenched, right? When pressed, when you press an ordinary reader on, why do they take this to be about the millennial predicament? Sometimes they end up saying something like, well, it is about the millennial predicament to me. It really speaks to me about my experience as a millennial. The account of artistic aboutness that I'm proposing here vindicates this kind of talk, right? It resolves these disagreements again by a little bit of a relativization, by relativizing the aboutness property over which ordinary readers disagree with critics and scholars. So relative to the conversation about what's important to the broader community, conversations with friends or normal people is about, say, miscommunication in romantic relationships. But relative to the conversations about what's important to an individual reader to whom the millennial predicament, whatever that is an important issue, these novels are about that as well. So these consequences or these upshots, I take it, they're pretty uncontroversial. But here's another one that I'm pretty sure is poised to provoke some objections. Consider what exactly my account spells out for interpretative disagreements in which one of the sides appeals to the intention of the artist. So we talked about one of these at the beginning. Is Baldwin's novel really about bisexuality? Is it really about race? Examples like these are really, really numerous. I mean, is it about bisexuality even though the author denied it? Is it about race even though the author denied it? Is Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 not about totalitarianism, the horrors of fascism and Stalinism, because that's what the author claimed? This might come as a surprise, but apparently Bradbury claimed and even insisted that Fahrenheit 451 is about the dangers of technology and not about not about totalitarianism. I mean, you can think about more extreme cases too, cases where artists denied that their work is about anything at all. Think about some contemporary art. That's not uncommon. On my account, authorial denials are not decisive, right? If we have good reasons to interpret some work of art as being about T, but believe that the author did not intend it to be about T, we're still licensed on my account to interpret it as being about T. So in other words, my account licenses interpretative practices that do not privilege authorial intention. And that opens it to some, I think, pretty interesting objections on normative grounds, on the grounds of what we ought to do. And so in the remaining part of this talk, I'd like us to take a look at a couple of these objections. Now, these objections have been made by intentionalists like Noel Carroll, but not only. So intentionalists, as I mentioned, are the proponents of the view that the work-meaning properties of works of art are fixed by the intention of the artist. Intentionalists sometimes argue that their opponents license interpretative practices that deviate from communicative norms. Right? And that's the sort of argument that I think can be made against the position that I'm presenting here. This argument presupposes a certain view on the nature of interpretation. So interpretation on this view is a conversational activity. And conversation, like all communicative activities, is cooperative. Now, on this view, when we enter a conversation, we seek certain rewards associated with cooperative activities, and we take on certain duties associated with cooperative activities as well. Now, let's think about the first argument that appeals to this sort of view. This is an argument made by Noel Carroll, who I believe presented or was interviewed by the APS a few months ago. I have mixed feelings about challenging Carroll's view. I really admire his work, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so Carroll is interested in the rewards that we seek when we enter conversations. He argues that genuinely cooperative activities produce this and a really valuable sense of community or communion with people that we cooperate with. So the more cooperative we are, the more rewarding our activity is. And in conversation, according to Carroll, the sense of community or communion arises from the understanding of what our interlocutors intend to convey, right? So if we want our conversations to be rewarding, we are committed to maximizing our understanding of these intentions. And that, on Carroll's view, gives us really, really strong and maybe even overriding reasons to go or to opt for interpretative practices that prioritize the intention of the speaker, or in the case of works of art, the intention of the artist. So when it comes to art, according to Carroll, whatever reasons we have to interpret some work of art as being about tea, we ought not to do that if we believe that the artist did not intend it to be about tea. Otherwise, our conversation with the author is just not going to be fully cooperative. And we're going to lose the sense of community or communion that cooperative conversations provide. Now, this argument does seem strong, or at least plausible, but there are certain issues with it too. And the most important one of these issues, I think, is the view that it relies on, the view that conversation, like all communicative activities, is cooperative, and that when we enter conversation, we seek certain rewards that cooperative activities offer us. Now, descriptively, I mean, when you think about how things work sort of out there in the world, it's not the case that all conversations are cooperative. And philosophers of language have been drawing attention to these cases of uncooperativeness for quite some time. I mean, it seems that they're fairly common. It seems that ordinary conversations involve moves in which, for example, speakers imply things that they would subsequently deny. Some of these cases are pretty dark, right? Insinuations and dog whistles are examples of uncooperative conversational moves of this sort. But the picture is pretty complicated, not just descriptively, but normatively too. It's plausible, it is plausible that rationally conducted conversations are cooperative, but it's not clear to me whether the aim that interlocutors seek to achieve and the rewards that they're after are always or must be of the sort that Carroll assumes they are. So on some views associated with the tradition that that stems from Paul Grice, the aim of a rational conversation is mutual understanding. So we try to understand each other, or we, slightly more technically, we try to identify the communicative intentions of our interlocutors. On another family of views associated with Robert Stalnaker, David Lewis, the aim of a rational conversation is, again, roughly problem solving. So we try to resolve the question at stake, or a little more technically, we try to converge on a set of possibilities that resolves this question. And if the latter is true, if the second, the problem-solving picture of rational conversations is true, then we might be cooperative without maximizing our understanding of what the speaker intends to convey. So we might have cooperative and rewarding conversations with artists without interpreting their works as being about what they intended them to be about. Now, so much for Carroll's argument. Now let's consider another argument that presupposes a very similar view on the nature of interpretation. It views it as a conversational and therefore a cooperative activity. This argument is made by Robbie Kubala, and I believe Kubala is not an intentionalist, but he's sort of sympathetic to it. Kubala argues that when we enter a conversation, we commit ourselves to cooperating with our interlocutors, and in particular, we take on certain duties associated with cooperative conversations. The most relevant one here is the duty of charity, or sometimes, as it's sometimes called, charitability. Now, according to Kubala, charitability is a perfect duty, a duty that cannot be flouted. And now, how does it get flouted? Well, on Kubala's view, it happens when we incorrectly ascribe to works of art some intention-dependent properties, properties of tone, properties of purpose, or the so-called categorical properties like genre and style. And even though Kubala doesn't claim that aboutness is an intention-dependent property, we can imagine someone who would develop his argument that way. The objector would argue that my account of artistic aboutness, according to which we can interpret a work of art as being about T, even if we believe that the artist did not intend it to be about T, is problematic because it licenses or sort of permits interpretative practices that flout or violate the duty of charitability. Now, charitability, I gotta say, is an extremely contentious notion, and very unfortunately, Kubala doesn't define it, so we're gonna have to define it for him. Intuitively, we understand that we ought to interpret conversational moves charitably, right? That seems to be pretty intuitive. But what exactly does that mean? Now, the consensus among philosophers is that the duty of charitability commits us to interpreting conversational moves in a way that maximizes some of their valuable features: potential for agreement, truthfulness, relevance, rationality. I mean, lots and lots of candidates. And among these, relevance seems to be particularly promising. I mean, think about the example we looked at before, right? The one that you have on your screens. So Max has been sad since he broke up with Sam. Lately, though, Max has been hanging out with Jesse and his mood has improved. Now, suppose this conversation is about Max's romantic life. In that case, we, or hearers, or we as imaginary interlocutors, have a couple of interpretative options. We can interpret the move literally. We can, on that interpretation, it turns out to be pretty much entirely off topic. Or we can interpret it as a hint that Max, the person whose romantic life we're discussing, is now seeing Jesse. On that interpretation, the conversational move turns out to be perfectly on topic. So the latter seems to be more charitable than the former, right? But why exactly is that? I'm sensing a potential for objections, and I'm looking forward to these, actually. I'm super interested in what you folks have to say. Okay, so it seems to me that to interpret a conversational move charitably is, among lots of other things, to maximize its relevance to the pre-assigned topic of the conversation. And that's exactly what the second interpretation does, right? It maximizes the relevance of what has been said to the pre-existing or pre-assigned topic of the conversation. Now, I don't think the duty of charitability commits us to anything more drastic than that, but I'd be very curious to hear if you folks think otherwise. But in particular, I don't think it commits us to reassigning the topic of the conversation in a way that makes a move maximally relevant to us. Otherwise, hijacking a conversation would be a very easy task. Now, if I'm right about that, then, well, the same is the case with respect to works of art. To interpret a novel or a film charitably is to maximize its relevance to the topics of the conversations in which it participates. That is, to interpret it as much as possible as being about something that's important to us, to the broader community, or to the art world. And doing that as I'd like to argue, is perfectly consistent with interpreting the work as being about tea, even if we believe that the artist did not intend it to be about tea. I mean, in fact, it might even require us to interpret it that way. So in other words, the account of artistic aboutness that I'm proposing here does not or doesn't seem to license interpretative practices that flout the duty of charitability. Contrary to a possible intentionalist objection, the practices that it licenses are perfectly consistent with that duty. Okay, now let's just sum up. I've argued that artistic aboutness is a species of conversational aboutness, and that for a work of art to be about tea is for it to be a conversational move in a conversation about tea. I argued that in works of art, as in conversations, aboutness is fixed by the mutually recognized agreement between the interlocutors. Works of art, as I claimed, are conversational moves made in formal institutional settings. And by making a work of art, an artist accepts an invitation to participate in several conversations guided by the norms of the art world, and agrees to make conversational moves on the topics fixed by these norms. I argue that this account suggests a way to resolve some interpretative disagreements over artistic aboutness, and that this account is immune to intentionalist objections that appeal to conversational norms. Again, thanks folks for your attention. I know this has been a long talk, and I really appreciate your being here. And I'm really, really looking forward to your questions, suggestions, and objections. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andriy.